Well, good morning. Happy Monday, everybody. I hope you're all well. Um, just setting a few things here. Yeah, so it's a late start because I was moving the entire project. I had a backup of the complete project rather than just a part of the project like I usually do. And so I had to move that over, and that took some time. And it's going to be a really short stream, like 20 minutes, because I have to go at 7 o'clock my time because it's an early start to the morning. So I have to be somewhere by 10 o'clock, and that somewhere is a good 2.5 hour drive away. So I need to get going. So anyway, we'll do what we can this morning. And I just wanted to review a few things. First of all, hope you had a great weekend. That was somebody being very noisy in town at a very early hour with their motorcycle. Small town, we all know who he is. He's in his own world. So, the big news over the weekend, as far as this project is concerned, is that I actually did a build. I haven't done a build of this project in probably close to 3 years now, 2.5 years. And at the time, it didn't work very well. And the new build basically works. It's pretty rough. So I'm not going to make it available just yet. There's a whole bunch of things that I need to brush up. But it was something of a milestone because things are mostly working. Most of the systems seem to work together pretty nicely. And I knew that doing a build was one of the big kind of empty, silent tasks that was sitting before me. I hate doing builds because they're a little bit harder to bug hunt and to fix. And also, the way things act in the editor is quite frequently not the way things act when you get down to the point of running them in the build. And that's exactly what happened to me. So I had to spend a bunch of time this weekend trying to troubleshoot that. I was getting, 50, 60, sometimes 80 or 90 frames per second in the editor, and I know it's running smaller, but the editor also adds its own overhead. And in the build, and this is a Mac build, and those are always special, in the build, I was getting like 10 frames per second. That's kind of the opposite the way it should be. It should run a little bit quicker. So I worked through some things and got it back up to running at an acceptable level. So that's a good success on top of this whole thing, but it feels really good to get to this milestone of having a build. Having said all of that and putting all of that aside, we don't have a lot of time this morning. There's some things that I really need to do that are quite tedious but really important for setting up a build. Also, I need to redesign this screen. It looks, it's too big. Like, it's nice and crisp here, but when it runs in the build, it's a little bit mushy. I always have trouble with my builds in Unity. They look really crisp on screen, and then they run at a really mushy level. For real. But that's a thing that I can kind of work with a little bit later. One thing I need to work on, though, is the system for collecting events in the game. So that's really what we're going to work on today. So that has almost nothing to do with this entire start menu scene that we're seeing right now. So I am just going to kill all of this, and we're going to jump right back into the old scene that we're used to. I'm not 100% certain this is actually going to run without having to run through this start scene right now. So let's find out what happens. And then we'll jump into the thing we're supposed to. And hopefully, if it gets going, the starting music isn't going to be overwhelming. I noticed on my stream that it was both kind of choppy and combed. I really don't understand why that's happened. And also, it's really overwhelmingly loud. So I'm going to watch my levels over here. That's a little better. Yeah. Okay, I had all the sound coming from the desktop cranked all the way to the max. Sorry about that. For anybody who's been listening to this and been blasted out of the water by my music and sound effects and things, my apologies for that. Okay. So the thing we're going to be working on is the system. There's a little bit of a bug in the system for collecting events. Those are those cutscenes. I'm not actually sure where we're at for a load of this game. Oop, bonk bonk. Let's see. This might tell us there's an event ready for pickup. Yeah, so it says there's a temporal shift at this end, which is an event. And those are the items in yellow. I've got to figure out a way to figure that one out. Also, I've got to deal with the music while we're in these menus. That'll be easier. Anyway, we've already collected this event, so we shouldn't have the yellow 200 superimposed there. The event is that kind of quote-unquote cutscene where there's all those kind of like shimmery ghost figures, and you take the box out of their hands, as Chris so helpfully pointed out on Twitter. I hadn't thought of taking it right out of their hands, like reaching through time, but that is what you're doing. That's an event, a temporal shift, we want to call it, and that hasn't... that's been collected, quote unquote collected. So why is it still showing up in the system? Because one thing I want to do to encourage kind of play and real exploration across time and space in this game is I want to have a number of these temporal shift events, or whatever we're going to call them. And I want to have them spread out across this timeline. And there'll be kind of... So this timeline's kind of like a map to the game. And this is telling you where you are, like the now, and I got to still work on this whole UI because it's really ugly. But I want to have these little temporal shift events scattered across the timeline, and I would love to have the player try to work out a way to visit each one of those events. They're sort of like quest markers on the map. So I'd really like to encourage exploration that way, encourage kind of the puzzle of figuring out how to use which artifact to get you to that event, because depending on the time you're in, some artifacts are no longer available for time travel. So all of these sorts of things I want to have going. But once you've actually visited an event, I want that event to disappear from the timeline. And the event has actually shown up as collected, but why is it still in the timeline? So I need to jump into that system. In fact, let's just take a really quick look at our timeline to see what it thinks is going on. So timeline system, timeline event manager here. So active timeline events, there is one timeline event. It's called Chancel Scene 2300, which happens 200 years from present. See, it says it's not collected yet. It really needs to be collected. So what needs to happen is that once it gets collected, it then needs to be removed from this active timeline events list, so then it never appears there. But here's my collected timeline events. So there's nothing in that. So I need to jump into this code and see why this isn't happening. So anyway, that's what we're going to do in the next 10 minutes. I am really sorry for the short stream this morning. It was a busy morning too. Like the wind finally died. So you know that part in The Witcher 3 where you're kind of riding across the war-torn north and the trees are starting to whip around and Geralt says, "Wind's howling." That was this morning. It was apocalyptic levels of wind. It was so bad this morning before dawn, or at dawn, that my dog would not go outside. She was terrified of the noise. I mean, it was howling. Went for a run this morning, and we have a lot of hills in our town, and running down the hills against the wind was worse than running up them. It wasn't great, but it stopped. It's fantastic. I live in a box made out of mountains, and that's just where our town is, at the bottom of this box of mountains. We have two parallel mountain ranges running north-south, And then there's a little tiny mountain range running east-west, and that forms the base of the box. And the box is open in two little gaps to the east at the top of one range of mountains and at the bottom of one range of mountains. And that range of mountains runs about 80 miles north-south. And we're at the southern end, and we're kind of in an opening to the east. So you can see mountains all around us except to the east. And so when the wind comes from the west over the tops of all of those mountains, it goes howling down this kind of chimney of mountains down to the bottom of the box where we live, and then comes rushing out the exit to the east. And we get some apocalyptic winds sometimes. This morning was one of those times. Pretty scenery, but there's a reason all the trees lean to the east. Okay, where are we here? So let's go look at the collected. So each event on the timeline is represented as its own little tiny class, which is just called timeline event data, and all it does is hold data. I guess I could do this through some other forms, a scriptable object or something, and everybody talks about how great they are. I don't quite understand them yet. Haven't had the time to teach myself, so this is what works for me. It's probably deeply inefficient, but then again, everything I do is deeply inefficient. So let me just take care of this. There we go. Sorry for that interruption. Okay, so I've got 3 public lists here: timeline events, active timeline, and collected timeline events. Okay. I'm going to just be following this collected variable just to see at which point we kind of collect this event. So collected, I have a method that listens. So it's a subscriber sort of pattern. Okay. So when you unlock, there's an unlock event here. So not quite sure when that gets called. And you can lock it, and that's where you set collected to true. Where else do I set collected to true? And when am I sending this lock event? I'm locking and unlocking these, that's right, in response to player action. And that's fine. This stops the alert that appears in the UI. Set up the timeline, that's fine. So the timeline isn't linear, it's kind of a rough logarithmic, because I have so much time to show and so little stuff at the end, but quite a lot at the beginning. So that's all setting that kind of stuff up. Set object on the timeline. This is about the artifact collection date, so that's not really useful to me. Clear object on timeline. Event collected. Okay, this is where it gets dumb. It gets a little bit strange here. I have this kind of now event thing. I'm not 100% certain why. I think the now event is whatever event is actually now. So this is probably where my logic is breaking down. Yeah, I'm going to walk myself through my logic I'm using here. So I send an event. And it's this event collected one, and I send the name of the event, which is, we'll just call it now event. So whatever event is happening at the same time that the user is. So that tells me that the event has been sent. So if the event name equals now event, okay, good enough. So for every object in my active timeline events, it goes through and it checks its name, or checks its date. If the event date equals now event behavior my date, so what's the now event behavior? Event name equals active timeline event ID. Okay, fine. And then we're also going to run through the active timeline events. We lock it, collected timeline, adds it to the collected timeline events pool. And it removes the active timeline event. Okay, so this is where things are breaking down. So I don't know what this now event behavior is. There's far fewer of those in the scene. Setup timeline is running. Okay. So why can't I, if the event name is now event, which means whatever's right at this here, why can't I just run through my timeline events that are sitting on the timeline? And if I find one where the dates match up, the event name now turns into the name of the actual event we're seeing. Okay. And then I run through the timeline. I know the event I'm having, so I should just be able to pluck this out. I'm not sure why I have this little bit of logic in here. I'm going to remove this. I can't remember how to do a removal like that. It's that way. Grand Central, that's what it is. Instance dot current date. There we go. So if the event date equals our current date, event name equals, there we go. And then we should be able to lock it. And lock the event name. The event ID equals the sent name, timeline events dot collected equals true. Yep. So that means that it's been collected. It should be removed from the active timeline events. Set temporal shift text. What does that do other than just set the text? I'm wanting to pop this off the timeline. This is the last thing to do. Temporal shifts detected, great. Okay, that's not helping. Probably needs to be this, clear object on timeline. Yeah, I need to pop this guy off the pool. Yeah, that doesn't get called. object on timeline. We need to do a remove object from timeline. Right, so I need to create a little method. I don't seem to have a method for actually just removing the object from the timeline. Yep. All right. Because this doesn't seem to, this clear object on timeline doesn't actually seem to take an object. It just takes the last object from the timeline object count here. It just, yeah, that doesn't seem to really work. That doesn't do what I would think it would say. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. I gotta go in. I'm just gonna set this one up here for me so that I know what's happening. We should do it under lock probably. And I'm going to send it the whole event. So then I can do things with that event. So something like that. Okay. Well, I know it wasn't much today, but this is as far as we're going to get. There we go, all compiled. Okay. Well, I apologize for all of that. It was a very short one today, but I gotta run. So, we will see you on Wednesday when I don't have to get quite such an early start to my day. So until then, enjoy the beginning of your week. Bye.